The autumn night was unusually cold in Chicago as Dr. Marcus Young drove his black BMW home from another late evening at the courthouse. The digital clock on his dashboard showed 11:45 p.m., and the streets were nearly empty. He had spent hours reviewing cases for the next day, something he had done countless times during his 15 years in the legal profession. Marcus adjusted his navy blue tie, slightly loosened after the long day. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from years of hard work and dedication. His grained temples and wire-rimmed glasses gave him a distinguished appearance that commanded respect in the courtroom. As he turned onto Lakeshore Drive, blue and red lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. Marcus checked his speedometer. He was driving exactly at the speed limit. With a deep sigh, he knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't his first experience with this kind of situation. Following proper procedure, Marcus turned on his interior lights, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over to the side of the road. Through his side mirror, he watched two white officers approach his car, one on each side. The taller officer, whose nameplate read Bennett, tapped on his window with a flashlight. License and registration, Officer Bennett demanded without any greeting or explanation for the stop. His partner, Officer Carson, stood on the passenger side, his hand resting on his holster. "Good evening, officer," Marcus responded calmly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "May I reach for my documents in the glove compartment?" Officer Bennett nodded curtly, his flashlight beam following Marcus's every movement. As Marcus handed over his license and registration, he noticed Bennett's expression change slightly upon seeing his credentials. "Step out of the vehicle," Bennett ordered, his tone growing more aggressive. "May I ask why, officer? I haven't violated any traffic laws," Marcus asked politely but firmly. "I said step out of the vehicle." Bennett's voice rose sharply. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Marcus knew his rights but also understood the dangerous reality of his situation. He carefully opened his door and stepped out, his expensive Italian leather shoes crunching on the gravel. At 6 feet tall, he stood eye to eye with Officer Bennett. "I smell marijuana coming from your vehicle," Officer Carson suddenly announced from the passenger side, though Marcus hadn't touched drugs in his life. "That's impossible, officer. I don't use any illegal substances," Marcus stated clearly, maintaining his composure despite the rising tension. "Spread your legs and put your hands on the hood," Bennett commanded, roughly pushing Marcus toward the car. The cold metal of handcuffs suddenly bit into his wrists. "This is unnecessary and illegal," Marcus protested calmly. "You have no probable cause for this search or arrest." Officer Carson had already begun ransacking Marcus's car, throwing his briefcase contents across the seats and pulling up floor mats. His case files scattered in the wind, and his laptop crashed to the ground. "Stop resisting," Bennett shouted, though Marcus hadn't moved a muscle. The officer tightened the handcuffs until they cut into Marcus's skin. "I'm not resisting," Marcus replied evenly, wincing at the pain. "I'm a federal judge, and you're violating my constitutional rights." Both officers laughed. "Yeah, right," Carson sneered. "And I'm the President of the United States." Marcus remained silent as they continued their illegal search, mentally recording every detail of the encounter. His judicial ID lay face down on the ground where it had fallen from his wallet, unnoticed by the officers in their overzealous search. After finding nothing illegal, the officers grew more frustrated. Bennett grabbed Marcus's arm roughly and started dragging him toward the patrol car. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest and suspicious behavior," Bennett declared, pushing Marcus's head down as he forced him into the back seat. Officer Bennett, badge number 8741, and Officer Carson, badge number 9238, Marcus memorized quietly. "I want both of your body cameras to be preserved." The officers exchanged uneasy glances at his calm recitation of their information, but it was too late. Their racial profiling and abuse of power had already set in motion events that would change their lives forever. What they didn't know was that in less than 3 months, they would face the consequences of their actions in a most unexpected way. As the patrol car pulled away from his BMW, Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his expensive suit wrinkled and his wrists bleeding slightly from the too tight handcuffs. But behind his composed exterior, His mind was already preparing for the legal battle ahead. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as officers Bennett and Carson arched Dr. Marcus Young through the booking area. Other officers glanced up briefly, then quickly looked away. The sight of a well-dressed black man in handcuffs was nothing new in Chicago's 15th precinct. "Empty your pockets," Bennett ordered, shoving a plastic bin across the counter. With his hands still cuffed, Marcus couldn't comply. Carson roughly patted him down, pulling out his wallet, phone, and keys. The booking sergeant, a heavy-set man named Rodriguez, looked up from his computer. "Charges?" "Resisting arrest and suspicious behavior," Bennett replied, starting to fill out the paperwork. "Possible drug possession, too. We smelled marijuana in his vehicle." Marcus spoke up clearly, his voice steady despite his treatment. "I'd like to make my phone call, and I need medical attention for my wrists." Blood had begun to stain the cuffs of his white dress shirt where the handcuffs had cut into his skin. "Shut up," Carson snapped. "You'll get your call when we say so." Rodriguez frowned slightly at the blood but said nothing. He began taking Marcus's fingerprints, pressing each finger firmly against the scanner. When he reached for Marcus's wallet to verify his identity, his eyes widened. "Officers," Rodriguez called out, his voice tight. "A word, please." Bennett and Carson followed Rodriguez to a corner of the room. Marcus couldn't hear their whispered conversation, but he saw Rodriguez holding up his judicial ID. The officers' faces drained of color. "That's probably fake," Bennett argued, but his voice lacked conviction. Rodriguez picked up his phone and dialed quickly. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned to the officers. "That's Federal Judge Marcus Young. He was appointed to the bench 6 months ago. What the hell were you thinking?" The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Other officers who had been ignoring the scene suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Bennett and Carson stood frozen, the implications of their actions starting to sink in. A new figure burst through the precinct doors. Judge Sarah Chen, Marcus's colleague from the federal courthouse. Her normally perfectly styled hair was messy, and she wore casual clothes, clearly having rushed from home. "Marcus," she called out, hurrying over. "What happened to you?" Her eyes narrowed at his bloody wrists. "Get those cuffs off him right now," she demanded. Carson fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly as he released Marcus. Judge Chen pulled out her phone and began taking photos of Marcus's injuries. "This is going straight to the chief judge in the Department of Justice," she said firmly. Marcus finally rubbed his raw wrists, wincing at the pain. "Sarah, I need you to ensure their body camera footage is preserved," he said quietly. "And get me the incident report they filed." Bennett and Carson exchanged panicked looks. Their report had conveniently left out several key details of the arrest, and they both knew their body cameras would tell a different story. The precinct captain arrived, looking disheveled in civilian clothes. "Judge Young, I cannot apologize enough for this incident," he began, shooting daggers at his officers. "We'll launch an immediate internal investigation." "That won't be necessary, Captain," Marcus replied calmly, accepting a tissue from Judge Chen to dab at his wrists. "This matter will be handled at the federal level." As Marcus gathered his belongings, his phone lit up with missed calls and messages. News traveled fast in Chicago's legal community, and already, several civil rights attorneys had caught wind of the incident. Officers Bennett and Carson, Marcus addressed them directly for the first time since the arrest. Both men stiffened. "I suggest you both secure legal representation. You'll need it." The officers watched helplessly as Marcus walked out of the precinct with Judge Chen, their careers flashing before their eyes. What had started as another routine case of racial profiling had turned into their worst nightmare. In the parking lot, Marcus finally allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He leaned against Judge Chen's car, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. "You okay?" she asked softly. Marcus straightened his tie, his composure returning. "I'm fine, Sarah, but this ends here. Too many others have faced what I faced tonight without having a judge's badge to protect them." As they drove away from the precinct, Marcus began mentally preparing for the legal battle ahead. But neither he nor the officers could have predicted how their paths would cross again, in a way that would change not only their lives but the entire Chicago Police Department. The next morning, Chicago's legal community was buzzing with news of Judge Young's arrest. The federal courthouse's marble halls echoed with whispered conversations and angry discussions. By 9 a.m., Marcus sat in his chambers, reviewing the police report that had been rushed to his office. "This is completely fabricated," Judge Chen said, reading over his shoulder. She had stayed with Marcus at the hospital until 3 a.m. while doctors cleaned and bandaged his wrists. "They claim you were swerving and appeared intoxicated." Marcus adjusted his glasses, studying the report carefully. "They're trying to justify the stop," he replied, making notes on a legal pad. "But their body cameras will tell the truth." His assistant knocked and entered, carrying a stack of messages. "Judge Young, every major news outlet in the city is requesting a comment, and the chief judge wants to see you immediately." Marcus stood, straightening his fresh suit. His wrists still throbbed beneath crisp white bandages, hidden by his shirt cuffs. "Sarah, can you start the process to get those body camera videos?" In the chief judge's office, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Judge William Harrison, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, paced behind his desk. "This is an outrage, Marcus," Harrison fumed. "I've already spoken with the police commissioner and the mayor. They're scrambling to contain this." "With all due respect, sir," Marcus replied, "I don't want this contained. This needs to be exposed." Harrison stopped pacing. "The commissioner suggested handling this internally. They'll suspend the officers, transfer them, and let them continue this behavior somewhere else." Marcus interrupted. "How many other black men have they arrested without cause? Men who didn't have a federal judge's credentials to protect them." Meanwhile, at the 15th precinct, Officers Bennett and Carson sat in separate rooms, facing internal affairs investigators. The department had moved with unprecedented speed, launching an investigation within hours of the incident. "Your body camera footage doesn't match your report," the investigator told Bennett, replaying the video. There was no swerving, no smell of marijuana, no resistance. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It was dark. Maybe we misinterpreted." "Save it," the investigator cut him off. "You've done this before, haven't you? Profiled drivers, made up probable cause." In the precinct break room, other officers avoided Carson like he had a disease. His union representative had already told him to expect serious consequences. Both officers' phones kept buzzing with messages from reporters seeking comment. Back at the courthouse, Marcus met with federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights cases. The evidence was damning. The body camera footage, the false police report, Marcus's injuries, and a history of similar complaints against both officers. "We found 5 other cases in the past year," one prosecutor explained, spreading files across Marcus's desk. "All black men, all driving nice cars, all arrested on questionable charges that were later dropped." Marcus examined the files, his jaw tightening. Each case followed the same pattern: a late-night stop, claims of smelling drugs, rough treatment, false charges. But unlike the others, Marcus had the power and position to fight back. His office phone rang, the police commissioner himself, making another attempt to resolve this matter quietly. "Commissioner," Marcus said firmly, "this isn't going away. Those officers violated my civil rights, and apparently the rights of many others. This ends now." By late afternoon, the story had gone national. Cell phone footage from a passing driver had captured parts of Marcus's arrest, showing him standing calmly while being roughly handcuffed. The video went viral, with millions demanding justice. Judge Chen returned with more news. "The police department just announced both officers have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. And Marcus, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet showing security footage from another recent arrest by Bennett and Carson. The video showed them using the same tactics against another black driver, but this victim had been beaten when he protested his innocence. Marcus watched the footage in silence, his expression grim. The parallels were undeniable. His case wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a chance to expose a pattern of systematic abuse. As the sun set over Chicago, Marcus made his final decision. He would not accept a quiet settlement or allow this to be swept under the rug. Justice needed to be served, not just for him, but for every person who had suffered similar treatment without the power to fight back. Little did officers Bennett and Carson know, their worst moment was yet to come, and it would happen in the last place they expected: Judge Young's own courtroom. 2 weeks after the arrest, the internal affairs investigation had expanded far beyond officers Bennett and Carson. Bennett sat at his kitchen table, staring at the suspension notice in front of him. His wife had taken their kids to her mother's house, unable to handle the constant media attention. Across town, Carson drowned his worries in a bottle, ignoring calls from his union representative. "The department's trying to make us the scapegoats," Bennett complained during a meeting with his lawyer. "Everyone does these stops. We're just the ones who got caught." His lawyer, a tired-looking man named Phil Murphy, shook his head. "That defense won't work. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Judge Young's case alone could end your careers." Meanwhile, Marcus had returned to his regular duties at the federal courthouse, though the bandages on his wrists served as a constant reminder of that night. His colleagues treated him differently now, some with increased respect, others with awkward discomfort. One morning, his assistant rushed into his chambers. "Judge Young, you need to see this," she said, turning on the local news. A young black man named James Turner stood at a podium, tears streaming down his face. "When I saw what happened to Judge Young, I knew I had to come forward," he said. "These same officers arrested me last year. They planted drugs in my car. I'd lost my job, my apartment, everything." More victims came forward each day. The precinct's records showed that Bennett and Carson had made over 200 suspicious vehicle stops in the past year. 95% of those stopped were black or Hispanic drivers. The FBI launched its own investigation, sending agents to interview everyone involved. They discovered that complaints against the officers had been systematically buried or ignored. "The whole system is corrupt," Judge Chen told Marcus over lunch. "The department knew about their behavior and did nothing." Marcus nodded, reviewing a new stack of case files. Each story is worse than the last. One man spent 6 months in jail because they planted evidence. Another lost custody of his children. The pressure on the police department intensified. The commissioner held emergency meetings with city officials, trying to contain the growing scandal. Media trucks camped outside the precinct, waiting for new developments. Bennett and Carson's worlds continued to crumble. Their fellow officers shunned them, their families struggled with the shame, and their futures in law enforcement looked increasingly bleak. One evening, Carson showed up drunk at Bennett's house. "We should never have touched that judge," he slurred. "We should have checked his ID first." Bennett grabbed his former partner's shoulders. "That's exactly the problem. We shouldn't have done it to anyone, judge or not." The realization came too late. The next morning, both officers received target letters from the U.S. Attorney's Office, indicating they were the subjects of a federal criminal investigation. At the courthouse, Marcus presided over his regular cases, maintaining his reputation for fairness despite his personal trauma. But he couldn't ignore the impact his case had made. Civil rights organizations used his story to push for police reform. Law schools invited him to speak about racial profiling. "You've started something important," Judge Harrison told him. "Departments across the country are reviewing their traffic stop policies." The investigation revealed more than just individual misconduct. It exposed a culture of racism and cover-ups that had persisted for years. Senior officers had ignored complaints, destroyed evidence, and protected abusive cops. 3 months after the arrest, the U.S. attorney called a press conference. Both officers would face federal civil rights charges. The investigation had also led to charges against 3 supervisors who had helped cover up previous incidents. Marcus watched the announcement from his chambers, his expression somber. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice and change. That afternoon, he received a peculiar notification. A new case had been assigned to his courtroom, a civil rights lawsuit against several police officers for racial profiling and excessive force. As he read through the case file, his eyes widened. The defendants included officers Bennett and Carson, charged with a similar incident that had occurred just weeks before his own arrest. Marcus sat back in his chair, considering the irony of the situation. Soon, the officers who had profiled and arrested him would stand before him as defendants. But this time, he would be wearing his judge's robes, bound by oath to provide the fair trial they had denied so many others. The wheel of justice had turned full circle, and its next stop would be courtroom 304. Judge Marcus Young presiding. The morning of the first hearing arrived with tension thick in the air. Courtroom 304 was packed with spectators, journalists, and civil rights activists. Officers Bennett and Carson sat at the defense table, their faces pale and drawn, barely recognizable from the arrogant men who had arrested Judge Young 3 months earlier. Marcus adjusted his black robes in his chambers, preparing himself mentally for what was about to happen. Judge Chen knocked softly on his door. "Are you sure you want to handle this case?" she asked. "No one would blame you for recusing yourself." "I've reviewed the ethics guidelines carefully," Marcus replied. "This case is separate from my incident. As long as I can remain impartial, I have no legal obligation to step aside." At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois is now in session. The Honorable Judge Marcus Young presiding." Marcus entered the courtroom, his face a mask of professional composure. The gallery fell silent. Bennett and Carson's eyes widened in recognition, then quickly lowered to the floor. Their attorney, Phil Murphy, looked like he might faint. "Be seated," Marcus commanded, his voice steady and neutral. He shuffled through the case files on his bench, studying the charges. This case involved a young doctor who had been brutally arrested 2 weeks before his own incident. "Counsel, please state your appearances for the record," Marcus instructed. The prosecution went first. "Sarah Martinez for the United States, Your Honor." Murphy stood on shaky legs. "Philip Murphy for the defendants, Your Honor. And, if I may—" "Yes, Mr. Murphy. Given your recent history with my clients, we request that you recuse yourself from this case." Marcus had anticipated this. He pulled out a prepared statement and read it carefully. "I understand your concern, Mr. Murphy. However, the incident you're referring to is separate from this case and is being handled by different prosecutors. I've reviewed the judicial ethics guidelines extensively, and I find no legal basis for recusal." He continued, his voice firm but fair. "In fact, removing myself solely because your clients once arrested me would set a dangerous precedent. It would suggest that law enforcement officers could disqualify judges simply by having previous interactions with them." The prosecutors nodded in agreement while Murphy slumped in his chair. Bennett and Carson exchanged worried glances. As the hearing proceeded, Marcus demonstrated impeccable fairness. He ruled on objections from both sides with equal consideration. When Murphy fumbled through his arguments, Marcus patiently helped him frame his points correctly. During a brief recess, Martinez approached the bench. "Your Honor, we have new evidence. Body camera footage from 3 other incidents showing a pattern of behavior." Marcus reviewed the footage in his chambers. The similarities to his own arrest were striking. The same false claims about smelling marijuana, the same excessive force, the same fabricated reports. When court resumed, Marcus addressed the defendants directly for the first time. "Officers Bennett and Carson, you are accused of violating the civil rights of Dr. James Wilson through racial profiling and excessive force. How do you plead?" Both officers stood. Their voices trembled as they said, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Marcus noticed something different in their demeanor now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine fear. Not just fear of punishment, but fear of facing their actions in front of someone they had wronged. "Very well," Marcus said. "Trial is set for next month. Officer Bennett, Officer Carson," they looked up nervously. "You will remain free on bond, but I'm adding a condition. You must attend daily sessions at the Cultural Diversity and Anti-Bias Training Center." As the officers left the courtroom, reporters rushed to get statements. Inside, Marcus sat alone at his bench, reflecting on the strange turn of events. He had sworn an oath to uphold justice equally, even for those who had denied him that same justice. Judge Chen returned to his chambers later. "That was impressive, Marcus. Even their own lawyer couldn't believe how fair you were." Marcus removed his reading glasses, suddenly looking tired. "This isn't about revenge, Sarah. It's about showing them what real justice looks like. Maybe then they'll understand what they've denied to so many others." As the sun set over Chicago that evening, 2 very different scenes played out. In his chambers, Marcus prepared diligently for the upcoming trial, determined to ensure it would be fair and just. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, officers Bennett and Carson finally began to understand the true meaning of the phrase blind justice. The real test, however, was still to come. 1 month later, The trial began. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Dr. James Wilson, a young black cardiologist, took the witness stand. His testimony painted a familiar picture. "I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital," Wilson explained, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "Officers Bennett and Carson pulled me over. They said my taillight was out, but it wasn't. Then they claimed they smelled marijuana." Marcus listened intently, noting how Wilson's experience mirrored his own. The doctor described being roughly handled, his medical bags searched and contents scattered, and his protests ignored. "They kept saying I matched the description of a drug dealer," Wilson continued. "When I showed them my hospital ID, they said it must be fake." The prosecution presented the body camera footage. The gallery watched in silence as the video showed Wilson standing calmly while the officers grew increasingly aggressive. Just like in Marcus's case, the report didn't match the video evidence. During cross-examination, Murphy struggled to defend his clients. "Maybe my officers were just being thorough," he suggested weakly. "Thorough?" Wilson responded. "They handcuffed me so tight I couldn't perform surgery for a week. I had to cancel procedures on 3 cardiac patients." Throughout the proceedings, Marcus maintained strict professionalism. He ruled on objections fairly, gave both sides equal time, and showed no bias despite his personal experience with the defendants. On the third day, Officer Carson unexpectedly asked to address the court. Marcus allowed it, watching carefully as the officer stood. "Your Honor," Carson began, his voice shaking. "These past weeks at the Cultural Diversity Training Center, they've opened my eyes. Watching these videos, seeing our behavior from the outside," he paused, wiping his eyes. "We were wrong, not just with Dr. Wilson or with you, but with countless others." Bennett stared at his partner in shock. Their attorney tried to stop Carson, but the officer continued. "We had this unwritten system," Carson admitted. "Nice car, black driver, late at night. We assumed they were up to something. We never stopped to think about the lives we were destroying." Marcus maintained his neutral expression, but the courtroom was riveted. Carson turned to Dr. Wilson. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "What we did to you was wrong. We abused our power and let our prejudices control our actions." During the lunch recess, Judge Chen found Marcus in his chambers. "That was unexpected," she said. "Carson's confession could change everything." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It's a start. But real change requires more than just words." When court resumed, Bennett requested to speak as well. Unlike Carson's emotional confession, Bennett's was more measured but equally significant. "Working as a police officer, you develop habits," he explained. "Some are good, some are bad. We convinced ourselves we were just being good cops, but we were really just being racist. Seeing Judge Young on the bench these past weeks, watching him treat us fairly despite what we did to him, it's shown me what real justice looks like." The prosecution presented their final evidence. Statistics showing that Bennett and Carson had disproportionately targeted minority drivers, testimonies from other victims, and documentation of covered-up complaints. As the trial neared its end, Marcus faced his biggest challenge yet. He had to ensure his sentencing decision was based solely on the evidence in Dr. Wilson's case, not influenced by his personal experience with the officers. In his chambers that evening, Marcus wrote his decision carefully. The officers' recent realizations and remorse would be factors, but they couldn't erase the damage they'd done. The next morning, before announcing his decision, Marcus addressed the courtroom. "Justice isn't about revenge," he began. "It's about accountability, restoration, and change. Officers Bennett and Carson have shown remorse and understanding of their actions. However, they must also face consequences for violating Dr. Wilson's civil rights." The officers stood for sentencing, their faces showing acceptance rather than their former arrogance. They had learned something vital in Judge Young's courtroom, not just about justice, but about humanity. Looking down from his bench, Marcus saw not just 2 officers who had wronged him, but a system that needed change. His ruling would be another step toward that change, delivered with the same fairness they had denied to so many others. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Young prepared to deliver his sentence, knowing that his decision would send a message far beyond the walls of courtroom 304. Judge Young's sentencing of officers Bennett and Carson sent shockwaves through Chicago's law enforcement community. Instead of maximum prison time, he chose a different approach. The officers stood quietly, listening as Marcus continued. You will work with the Cultural Diversity Center to develop a new training program for police officers. Your body cam footage and testimony will be used to teach others about racial profiling. Additionally, you will meet monthly with victims of your past discriminatory arrests to understand the impact of your actions. Dr. Wilson, sitting in the gallery, nodded in approval. The sentence wasn't about punishment, it was about transformation and education. Finally, Marcus added, you'll both assist the FBI's ongoing investigation into systematic discrimination within the 15th precinct. Your cooperation must be complete and honest. The effects of the sentence rippled through Chicago quickly. Other officers began coming forward, admitting to similar practices. The police commissioner announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training and stricter oversight of traffic stops. 1 month into their sentence, Bennett and Carson stood before a room of police cadets at the academy. Their presentation began with the video of Dr. Wilson's arrest, followed by their own candid admissions. We thought we were good cops, Bennett explained to the silent room, but we were perpetuating a system of prejudice and abuse. It took facing Judge Young in his courtroom, seeing his fairness despite our treatment of him, to understand true justice. Carson added his perspective. We used to profile drivers based on race and nice cars. We'd make up probable cause, knowing the system would back us up. But standing in that courtroom, watching our own footage, we couldn't hide from the truth anymore. The changes weren't limited to Chicago. Police departments across the country began requesting copies of the training program. Civil rights attorneys used the case as a precedent in similar lawsuits. During their community service, the officers faced the neighborhoods they had once terrorized. They helped at community centers, worked with youth programs, and slowly began rebuilding trust. The monthly meetings with their past victims proved especially challenging. People shared stories of lost jobs, broken families, and shattered dreams, all because of false arrests and planted evidence. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting, Bennett approached Marcus in his chambers. Your Honor, he said, his voice humble. I never thought I'd say this, but your sentence saved us. Prison would have made us bitter. This is making us better. Marcus looked up from his desk. It's not about me, Officer Bennett. It's about breaking a cycle that's destroyed too many lives. The FBI investigation, aided by Bennett and Carson's testimony, revealed deep-rooted problems in the department. Several superior officers faced charges for covering up complaints. Internal affairs procedures were completely overhauled. 6 months into their sentence, the officers participated in a town hall meeting in the community. The tension was palpable as they faced residents they had previously arrested. We can't undo what we did, Carson admitted to the crowd, but we can help prevent it from happening to others. Judge Young showed us that justice and mercy can work together. An elderly woman stood up. My grandson spent 8 months in jail because you planted drugs in his car, she said, her voice trembling. He lost his scholarship because of you. Bennett listened, tears in his eyes. Ma'am, we're working with the Innocence Project now to review all our past arrests. We want to make things right. The media covered these developments extensively, from racist arrests to reform. How one judge's sentence changed policing, read one headline. Back in his courtroom, Marcus continued presiding over cases with the same unwavering fairness. His calendar now included regular progress reports from Bennett and Carson. During one such report, Judge Chen observed from the gallery. You've started something remarkable, she told Marcus afterward. These officers aren't just serving a sentence, they're becoming advocates for change. Marcus smiled slightly. Sometimes justice wears different faces, he replied. Sometimes it's not about punishment, but about transformation. As the sun set over Chicago that evening, Marcus watched from his chamber window as Bennett and Carson left the courthouse, heading to another community meeting. They walked differently now, not with the arrogance of power, but with the humility of understanding. The story wasn't over, but a new chapter was being written. One of redemption, reform, and real change. 1 year later, Judge Marcus Young stood at a podium in front of City Hall. Behind him sat officers Bennett and Carson, along with dozens of community members, police officials, and civil rights leaders. The occasion was the signing of the Young Wilson Police Reform Act, named after the judge and the doctor whose cases had sparked a movement. Change doesn't always come from punishment, Marcus began, addressing the large crowd. Sometimes it comes from understanding, from facing our mistakes, and from having the courage to transform them into stepping stones for progress. The new law mandated body cameras for all officers, required comprehensive bias training, and established civilian oversight committees. More importantly, it created a system of alternative sentencing for police misconduct cases, modeled after the rehabilitation program Bennett and Carson had undergone. After the ceremony, Dr. Wilson approached the former officers. They had worked together over the past year, turning their story into a teaching tool for police departments nationwide. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be standing here with the officers who arrested me, helping to change the system, Wilson said, shaking his head in amazement. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead to the greatest good. Bennett and Carson had completed their community service hours months ahead of schedule, but they continued volunteering. The youth center where they taught had become a model for police-community relations. Remember that first day at the center? Carson asked Bennett as they watched kids playing basketball. How nobody would even look at us. Bennett nodded. Now they call us Coach Mike and Coach Steve. Funny how things change. Their training program had been adopted by police academies in 30 states. The videos of their arrests, including Judge Young's, were now standard teaching materials. But it was their personal testimonies that made the biggest impact. We thought we were above the law, Bennett told a recent class of cadets. But Judge Young showed us that true justice is blind to badges and robes alike. The FBI investigation they had assisted led to significant changes. 17 officers faced charges, and dozens more were retrained. The 15th Precinct, once notorious for discrimination, became a testing ground for community policing initiatives. Marcus maintained his reputation for fairness on the bench, but his experience had added a new dimension to his judgments. He looked for opportunities for rehabilitation when possible, understanding that justice could be both firm and compassionate. During the final progress report, Bennett and Carson stood before him one last time. Your Honor, Carson began, when you sentenced us, we thought you were being too lenient. Now we understand you gave us the hardest sentence possible, facing ourselves and our actions every day. The easy path would have been prison, Bennett added. This was harder, but it mattered more. We're not just reformed officers, we're better people. Marcus listened thoughtfully. The measure of justice, he replied, isn't in the punishment, but in the change it creates. You've helped break a cycle that has plagued our city for generations. After the hearing, Judge Chen joined Marcus in his chambers. Did you ever imagine, that night when they arrested you, that it would lead to all this? Marcus looked out his window at the city's skyline. Sometimes the worst of humanity brings out the best in us. Those officers could have remained bitter, but they chose to be better. The story of the racist cops who arrested a judge, only to face him in court and find redemption, became more than just a headline. It became a blueprint for change, showing that justice could be both strict and merciful, that people could transform, and that understanding could bridge even the widest divides. That evening, as Marcus prepared to leave his chambers, he saw Bennett and Carson leading a community meeting in the courthouse lobby. Local residents, officers, and city officials sat together, discussing ways to build trust and understanding. He smiled, remembering the night of his arrest. The handcuff marks on his wrists had long since faded, but the impact of that night had left an indelible mark on the city's future. As he walked to his car, Marcus passed the spot where he had been arrested a year ago. The place that had once represented injustice now stood as a symbol of transformation. Sometimes, he realized, justice worked in mysterious ways, turning moments of darkness into catalysts for light. The story of Judge Young and officers Bennett and Carson became part of Chicago's history, not just as a tale of racism and redemption, but as proof that change was possible when justice was tempered with wisdom and mercy.